You're looking at Pavement, which is protected by CCTV. Have a think about that. Yep. So why should someone want to surveil a slab of concrete, ladies and gentlemen? No, I'm really, really serious about this. Why? A slab of concrete is protected by CCTV in Bristol. Well, we can assume that concrete will be watched, right? A lot of people today have nothing better to do. They'll watch concrete on YouTube. Just watch it. Might get 12 million hits, as we'll see in a moment. But there's also changes of a physical characteristic nature, usually toward maintenance. So if I watch concrete every day, every other day, every fifth day, every month, I might see something. And I might see a degradation, I might see a change, or I might see an exception. I might see humans walking on the concrete slab. I might see an animal coming past. I might see a car that shouldn't be on the concrete slab. But also the pavement's protected by CCTV because there is one camera for every 13 persons in the UK, although that's an understatement and we'll see why in a moment. But I also might see pavement for compensation, liability and insurance, as has been mentioned multiple times during this evening. So let's say we can assume that concrete will be watched for changes to physical characteristics towards maintenance. And as many of you would already know, the transport authorities do take vehicles and do traverse the landscape, hundreds of thousands of kilometers of stretch just to look at maintenance requirements, particularly in country areas. So common types of cracks in your concrete include plastic shrinkage, expansion, heaving, settling, overloading the slab, premature drying. And this is what it looks like. I could watch the slab. I could protect the slab of concrete because the concrete might undergo change. A lot of the ideology behind why there are CCTV cameras is to look for change, is to look for exceptions, is to look at different behaviors to the norm. So I watch concrete because maybe I want to do early intervention. Or maybe once I see a massive crack due to weathering, I may call in to support the replacement of that concrete or somehow sew it back together with something. And so I want you to keep this metaphor throughout the talk because we're protecting slabs of concrete with CCTV. And we can assume that concrete will be watched for compensation, liability, and insurance purposes. Let's have a look at what that might look like.
How many concrete workers does it take to stop a Zamboni?
See what's going to happen.
16.
Okay, now someone's going to put a stick in there.
We're walking away.
Somebody's got a big stick. A lot of activity.
Stick theory, he's going to go flying across try to kill the engine with water and hit the big stick. We're going to smother it with a tarp. We've now angered the machine. The machine is now angry. Okay, we're going to smother it with tarp.
This is actually going to work, I think.
Oh, ride him in the hole.
Oh, ride him, cowboy.
We've now got him in the hole, spin. Oh, ole. 8 seconds. 8 seconds is what we're looking for. He is now blinded and mad.
Oh, this is...
Oh,
This has got to be YouTube.
The film is rolling, Howard.
all right, now we're going to, now that we've irritated him, thrown him in the hole, we're up to 18 people now.
It'll run out of gas eventually.
Grab it. We got $50 to the first person to grab the tarp.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, we're still going now. It's not going down, it's fighting. The lions around the injured gazelle.
Okay.
Oh, there we go, $50.
So this 3-minute YouTube clip, which I've sort of put down to a minute, has received 12 million hits since it was posted. And if you look at the amount of footage that's being posted daily. It's a great number of bytes beyond what you could describe at the moment. The requirements for cloud storage are incredible. The requirements for capacity are incredible, load balancing, storage, and much more. And what we're finding is that our abilities to actually analyze the video are also increasing. So currently this is a scene, obviously in a civil construction, but the behavior of these workers could be analyzed in the future. If there was an accident, just like we saw in the last talk, we might well be analyzing the footage in another way. So imagine it wasn't the scene of the crime, maybe it was a scene of an accident where someone does lose their life, a machine does go out of control, and is there evidence of what happened? And this is a normal happenstance for anyone working with machinery, which could react in any way. But the thing is, we have volumes and volumes of this kind of data being uploaded. So I am watching a slab of concrete, but in this scene, something different happened. And we could look at interventions, behavioral analysis, we could do post-mortem, we could look at how the machine malfunctioned, how would you stop it in the future, and you could do this for many different purposes. Forgive me, I'll just move on to the next slide. So we could also do this for exceptions. In case of human beings, I can watch the concrete slab or the pavement. I can try to protect by CCTV. So here's another a piece of footage from earlier this year.
On June 4th, a 75-year-old protester approached a group of police officers during a demonstration for George Floyd in Buffalo, New York. Things escalated quickly when two officers shoved the protester to the ground. He was sent to the hospital for a head injury and is still recovering.
What you see here is the fact that people have become quite used to cameras. They also know what to do around cameras. A lot of police officers do hide badges. They didn't touch the gentleman who fell to the ground for obvious reasons, but it looks somehow quite insensitive to an onlooker. A 75-year-old man falls to the ground, is shoved, is not helped back up, or is not, they did immediately ring for help, but this notion of always being watched and police now living under what has been termed now for a decade, a new visibility, and really playing to a global theatre. That's a very different circumstance to what was policing about 15 years ago. Some police even will take out their own smartphone to capture their own scene while the moment is occurring. So I'm going to say that this 5.2 million, one camera for every 13 people is wildly underestimated. That's not counting everyone's smartphone. It's not counting in-vehicle cameras. It's not counting covert cameras. It's not counting all the domestic cameras and the multiple pinhole cameras now found in laptops, in computers, in a whole bunch of devices, tablets, and the list goes on and on. But I want to allude back to this here. 96% of the total number of cameras in the UK are now operated by private businesses and homeowners. So we keep pointing the finger at the government, but in fact, the greatest ownership is probably private business and homeowners, according to HR News. That's just one source. And I go back to some terse definitions here in the literature. Data valence, the Australian Roger Clark, who conceived of this term in the 1980s, looking at how data travels and what happens to data. Then around 2003, Steve Mann with surveillance, a Canadian who looked at sort of the inverse watching. If someone surveils me down here, I will just, return the camera view and the point of view back at the camera. And so there's an equivalence or some kind of equity that may occur. So if you record me, I'll record you. And he's been quite pronounced and in your face regarding how he has recorded others. He even has a passport photo with ITAP device, his own creation from MIT Media Labs back in the 90s, which is developed and probably one of the most depth perception aware cameras that he bears on his face. And then my husband, MG Michael, who conceived of the term Ubivalence back in 2006. He made it into the Macquarie Dictionary in 2008, but looks at the internalization, as we heard from the commissioner in the first talk, almost the predictive, what are you thinking, what are you feeling? The camera's on the inside out, so Big Brother on the inside looking out, almost to the point that these sensors and this infrastructure working together is able to denote what you're even thinking. And that work looks at different types of valences, right back from your satellite view, which is your traditional view, that we've had satellite images for so many years, then your street view at the ground level, the person view, I'm holding the phone and I'm looking outward, right down to the sensor view, which is the adoption of implantable devices or quantified self devices that one bears or wears on their body. And so this complete from the top right down to the lowest common denominator, and we've been researching this for some 20 years or so as a concept, but Ubivalence was born in 2006. And what that does is consider what's coming. Some work I'm doing with DARPA at the moment in the ELSI group, a non-funded or non-paid consulting group, looks at the ethical, legal, social implications of the potential to adjust the circadian rhythm in the body in order to overcome jet lag and traveler's diarrhea, but also to allow for greater potential in drug delivery in the future. And so the black box recorder on the inside looking out is no longer a science fiction. It's no longer conspiracy theory. It's no longer any of that. It's actually something that's being considered as plausible. And as far back as 2003, we had personal health records that were implantables. And so consider the flight recorder inside the human being that somehow is tethered to an outward device like a camera, and there's a 24-hour alibi that may present. And for all the reasons that Patrick just mentioned, I am deeply concerned about the potential of Ubivalence. So what is Ubivalence? It's the who, where, when, and what. So if I know who you are through some kind of biometric IMEI number on your phone or some identity token that you own or you hold, you possess. I know where you are through Wi-Fi, a proximity card that's discrete, some 10 centimeters away that's been tapped, or I use my fingerprints to do something, or I use my implant to allow me to be authenticated or to get access to something, or using the global positioning system, the nearest town, the nearest street, the nearest house number based on a geodetic address. Then, I know a lot of things. I may know your altitude, your speed. I'll definitely know a timestamp, and then I may have 14 additional sensors that are jam-packed into any particular device that you have. So what condition you're in goes back to the slab. I want you to keep thinking about the pavement and the idea of change over time. And with humans, because we move, we're not slabs of concrete, that becomes a very interesting scenario. So if I know who you are, where you are, what you're doing, then I can denote probably your intent, what you're thinking. And again, I want to go back to what the commissioner said about accuracy, about validation and assurance, all themes that I think will become increasingly important because smartphones are transferable. Cameras are transferable at the moment. But what we're probably looking down the track of is something that's non-transferable, like, something that is your fingerprint, although there have been ways to do fingerprints, depending on the type of reader there is. There are also people without fingerprints and without multimodal biometrics, whether it's eyes or other issues that they may have. So that's interesting, but we're talking about human activity monitoring of all people, and there are consequences for human rights with respect to human activity monitoring that's done in an unauthorized fashion. So the premise of proactive criminalization is if I can use big data, bring the islands of information together, I can analyze both structured and unstructured information and data in near real time or in real time, then I have a pretty good chance, allegedly, of preventing a crime, a bit like Minority Report, or convicting the criminal. And that's a bit of how the police mentality is at the moment. It was also a study that was conducted in 2013 at my conference by Lisa Shea, Colonel Lisa Shea at the time, who was at West Point. And she looked at what Ubivalence was pointing to. She brought together the panopticon, Ubivalence, privacy and countermeasures, and was looking at the use of sunglasses and the ways to sort of butt up against surveillance, counter surveillance, but also the complexity in the growing network surveillance infrastructure. And she proposed this kind of framework. She looked at all the different actors, the components in the systems engineering, the subjects, and she modeled this with her 4 or 5 co-authors from that group. And if we look at what is emerging today, here's a company in Australia, one of the foremost companies in the space, the company aptly called iOmniscient. And it looks at automated responses, it looks at big data analytics, it uses machine learning, it uses different kinds of behavioral analytics. It even has begun to investigate sound and smell analytics and facial recognition, and even, of course, the standard automatic number plate recognition. So using heuristics, neural network, deep learning, and other kinds of machine learning techniques, pretty much under the umbrella of AI, it's saying whatever your camera is, we can put in software. You know, the better the camera, the better the information you're going to get at the end. But even if your camera quality is a low resolution, we can attach software to the firmware and we can give it smarts, and everything is analyzed on the cloud. And a lot of the strategies that companies like this use is to get a good oblique shot. And how you do that, you know, many of you may not realize when you go to airports or transport hubs or other places, you'll often be, you know, greeted with a sign that takes you about a millisecond to read, but, you know, you're hovering to read that sign, like watch your step. And you're thinking, oh, someone's trying to protect my head from getting smashed from the concrete slab above me. But in actual fact, there's a camera that's just taking a nice photo of you in the best way possible. And these kinds of secrets have been revealed to me over time, but also just the lack of sensitivity towards privacy that some of these entrepreneurs have. You know, you mentioned GDPR, and often the response is, well, who cares about that? We'll just tell them anything they want to hear. And honest to goodness, that's actually how many of them think. When you look at some of their design philosophies, they only have to do with technology. There is no design philosophy from the socio-technical perspective. There is no sort of awareness of the legal side. It's like how fast can I create technology to sell using different kinds of applications and reusable components that can allow me to reach a greater part of the market with the least sort of disruption to my business model. So it is about general surveillance, but it doesn't really include society. It doesn't include politics. It doesn't include culture. It doesn't include context. It does definitely include what is known as operational effectiveness. And here you have some of the products that are available, but you can find many of these all over the web. I'm not trying to sell you anything. Rather, I'm trying to tell you that these come in very interesting packages, very alluring. But in work I have completed with Dr. Robert Abbas of the University of Wollongong, when we looked at technological responses to biosurveillance because of COVID-19, we used the Davis et al. Kind of model where we incorporated, you know, people, buildings, technology, culture, processes, regulatory frameworks, which are never spoken about by these tech companies, financial and economic circumstances, stakeholders, and so forth. And as we saw with COVID Safe in Australia, did it really reduce, you know, the goal was to reduce the number of infections. Did it really work? Actually, no. There was a couple of million of people who adopted it, but it didn't really work. Users were not consulted, specifically not early on in the process of development. It was rolled out with really no cultural awareness. The technology didn't always work. In fact, the majority of phones didn't have the particular Bluetooth sensor that was being called upon. The regulatory frameworks were somewhat adapted to reply, but quite late. People didn't really know when things were going to end. Even now, we're asked to check in Australia, despite the proportionality is quite low of COVID incidents. So we're always QR coding in, but for what reason? Apart from giving the data over to a marketing company that is Australia's #1 marketing platform. So Service New South Wales that has developed an app is actually giving the majority of the QR code data over to a marketing platform company, which is really bizarre when you think about it, because we're giving over social network data and physical network data over to a third party. But this kind of thing, we're not thinking about the major potential issues with how people feel about being surveilled. In this instance, I have an example of Hong Kong. People are holding umbrellas. They also suspected that these sort of sensor towers or blue pole towers were not only watching them, but listening to them. And this is when AI is able to integrate sound, vision, and much more. So I want you to start thinking about multimodal biometrics. It's not just about what these cameras are seeing, but actually what they're hearing. And this is a completely different context we're being catapulted into. Some case studies, I know I'm running out of time. I'm just checking my clock. But what are the risks of Ubivalence? And while we're touting tech for good, beneficial AI, which I strongly believe in, and public interest technology, we've also got the risk of misinterpretation of data, information manipulation to our own ends, depending on who's in charge, and misinformation. And so we've got identity, location, and condition. We can tag, track, and trace with biometrics and CCTV and a whole bunch of other technologies which are being used in a network surveillance way. It's not just standalone CCTV now, it's corroborated CCTV that sort of cover a smart region, whatever that is, if it's a city or a block. And it's about control, care, and convenience. You know, it's under the guise of I care for you and I'm going to make life more convenient for you, but the underlying dimension is control. MG Michael also talks about something called the axis of access. And I want you to study this very carefully. It's one of the last slides, where the people who have the least access are usually the people who are being surveilled, whereas the ones who have the smarts or are the manufacturers of these devices or are the service providers actually have more access to the data. And we can see that with implantable devices, for example, and kill switches, and who has the right to heart pacemaker information. And as we get more involved in sensor data, that's going to be a big thing when the government says, but hang on a second, you know, the only way I can get to the data is through a secret intelligence arm, and the AI companies are going, but we know the way to do it. And the government is saying, please teach us. But even more rogue is when the hackers go, whoop, you know, personally identifiable information, biometrics that can't be altered very easily. I'll think we'll just buy a bit of those and then sell them on the dark web. And you can't change the color of your eyes, or you can with contact lenses, but you know what I mean. You can't really change your fingerprints and the way your face looks unless you break your nose, which has been done and has been proven to break the biometric reader in a way that it can't be read. You put on weight really quickly, or you take weight off quickly, or plastic surgery, of course. So there are ways to dupe systems. They're not foolproof. And then there's the other argument, what about dual use technology? So I've talked to you greatly about Ubivalence and even what you're thinking and this blanket coverage surveillance. But on the other hand, what about using it to find lost children, as this provider says, or to do dementia wonder alerts? Surely we can get to a point that we can trust technology, but what has to change? And so all of these socio-technical legal factors, going back to the term that was used by the commissioner, they're socio-technical systems. They're not just technical systems. We do have to incorporate this notion of authoritarianism versus a democratic system. Politics and economic systems actually matter. The idea of whether we go for a collective or the individual. China keeps touting that they're doing great with surveilling particular minority groups, and it's for the hope of the collective. What about human rights and personal dignity and freedom? There are people with mental health concerns that hate visual surveillance. They hate, and they could be legitimized fears, or they might be illegitimate. But what we're seeing is an incidence growing of people becoming more and more paranoid over cameras and not wishing to actually leave their house. So as soon as that you leave your house, you're playing to a global theater. Privacy, trust, cybersecurity, and data rights, things I'll gloss over, but I shouldn't. Psychological impacts, government ownership versus business ownership, and then people working together. Digital transformation, shifting responsibility to the machine, and this movement away from neighborhood policing to what's now called IT evidence-based or led policing. So pavement protected by CCTV, or is the pavement watched by CCTV? And people are not pavements. Remember that, ladies and gentlemen, and responsibility cannot be outsourced to machines. So people are not pavements. People are not pavements, and responsibility cannot be outsourced to the machine. Thank you very much.